Halbertal was named a member of Israel's Academy for the Sciences and Humanities. Brigadier General Cindy Jebb is the Dean of the Academic Board at the West Point U.S. Military Academy. She has taught courses in comparative politics, international security, cultural anthropology, terrorism and counterterrorism, and officership. Commissioned as a military intelligence officer, Jebb served in the National Security Agency, amongst other places. She has authored 3 books, conducted human security research in Africa, completed study projects in Iraq and Afghanistan, and served as a senior advisor to the Chief of the Office of Security Cooperation Iraq during the summer of 2015. Michael Walzer, today's moderator, has written about a variety of topics in political theory and moral philosophy, including political obligation, just and unjust war, nationalism and ethnicity, economic justice, and the welfare state. He has played a critical role in the revival of a practical, issue-focused ethics and in the development of a pluralist approach to political and moral life. Walzer's books include Just and Unjust Wars, which Dean Jebb said she taught to her students at West Point, On Toleration and Arguing About War. Just a note, if you haven't already seen the exhibit, the Eichmann exhibit, how many have been through? So what compelled me to put this panel together for the museum is a clip at the end from the trial, and if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go, where the prosecutor speaks to Adolf Eichmann and says, do you have any regrets for what you did? And he said, I followed my command. I never broke an oath. And the prosecutor says, do you mean that breaking an oath is a worse crime than killing tens of thousands, and we know millions of people? And he says, yes, breaking an oath is the worst crime a man can commit. So with that as a focal point of our conversation, I turn it over to our esteemed panel. Thank you.
I want to welcome all of you. I'm glad that so many of you went to see the Eichmann exhibit. We have just walked through it very much too quickly. The claim of just following orders that Eichmann made he made in the context of a bureaucracy. And the Israeli court quite rightly rejected the claim. It's very different, and it's much harder when the claim is made not in a bureaucracy, but in an army. And that's going to be the focus of our discussion today. And the judgments we make with regard to an army are harder for 2 reasons. First, because armies require discipline and obedience. A disciplined army fights better, not only militarily, but also morally. A disciplined army, unless it's a Nazi army, but a disciplined army, like the American or the Israeli army, doesn't murder, rape, or plunder. And those practices often occur with undisciplined or collapsing armies. So we want we want soldiers to be obedient. And then it's also a difficult judgment because we're asking soldiers to recognize the importance of obedience, of obeying orders, and at the same time to recognize that sometimes obedience is wrong. And that second recognition has to come, or often comes, in the heat of battle, which makes it especially hard. So I'm going to suggest 4 sets of questions just to guide our conversation. First, what are the limits on obedience? How does a soldier know when an order is illegal or immoral? And second, what can we expect of soldiers, of 19, 20-year-old kids in the field in the heat of battle? Do we expect public protest at an illegal order? Do we expect outright disobedience? Do we expect quiet evasion? What can we expect of soldiers in the field? And then if a soldier obeys an immoral or illegal order and is brought to trial, how do we judge the claim of superior orders or the claim of duress? I acted under duress. And finally, what about the responsibility up the chain of command? Who is responsible for what superior officers are responsible for the orders that are given in the field by a lieutenant or a captain, who may be immediately responsible, but may not be the only person who is responsible. So, I don't know who wants to.
Well, since I'm closest, first of all, I just want to thank the museum, Alyssa and Michael, for inviting me to be on this esteemed panel. I feel very honored and humbled to be on this panel with such two phenomenal people and scholars. Second, I will share with you just coming out of and I also just went too quickly through the exhibit, but to come out and then see the Statue of Liberty, it's very powerful, and then Ellis Island. My great-grandmother came through Ellis Island, and so I'm a New Yorker at heart, so it's wonderful to be here. And maybe those are big overarching questions, and maybe just start with what the academic program as a component to educating, training, and inspiring leaders of character is designed to do to prepare our graduates who graduate with a Bachelor of Science and a commission, the kind of preparations that when they are faced in such, whether heat of battle or presented in a very complex situation, why we can be confident in their ability to think through and make good judgments. But let me just start a little bit with our mission, which is educate, train, and inspire leaders of character. And that is first and foremost. We have an academic program, a military program, a physical program, and you can be the best intellect, but if you're not grounded in values, you fail. Martin Luther King talked about education is both intellect and character. And we all know that you can be very educated intellectual, but you might be missing that character component. So that is what's very important. The way we approach it on the academic side is that we have a broad liberal education, which is 50% social sciences and humanities and 50% math, science, and engineering. And that is designed mostly how to think as opposed to what to think. And then we have an ability for a study in depth component, 38 different majors, different minors, and how we think about ethics, how we think about terrorism, how we think about cyber, so you get an interdisciplinary approach, which I think basically is designed, it's important to master your major, your discipline, but to have the humility to know that you don't have all the answers, and you need to seek new knowledge and know what questions to ask. And then I think and we have a connection to this museum, which helps us elevate our game. General Milley, our Chief of Staff of the Army, asked us not just to prepare leaders of character to be critical thinkers, but to be independent thinkers, that they have the confidence in their own agency to contribute and make a difference, and yet still have humility. And the kinds of programs that we're able to do, such as partnering with this museum, specifically through our Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, provides cadets an opportunity to go out and actually apply theory. And so I had the wonderful opportunity to join them this past summer when there was a dinner here, and was preparing the cadets, along with midshipmen from the Naval Academy, cadets from the Coast Guard Academy, cadets from the Air Force Academy, to frame the experience before they went off to Poland, and they toured Auschwitz and learned more what was going on there. And just hearing from the cadets who were on that program and talked about the importance of you can't be bystanders, you can't be just following orders, these kinds of things. That's what elevates our game. As well as providing tremendous, we had 1,000 internships this summer, many of them overseas working with non-governmental organizations on complex problems. But that's what's very important as our cadets get to learn about different cultures and people. And that is what provides more self-awareness. And maybe as we get into the conversation, the importance of knowing your own vulnerabilities is very important, so that the graduation is just the start point of continual lifetime of development of character. You're not just inoculated one time and you're good to go. It's a embracing of the struggle, which everyone has, as we're all trying to do the right thing. And maybe I'll stop there, because I think we'll have more conversation. Thank you.
Well, thanks, and thanks for the invitation. It's a great honor being here. We just saw the exhibition. Actually, my father, who's a Holocaust survivor, came to South America after the war because the Uruguayans were giving visas. And I grew up in Uruguay and was a kid in Argentina when Eichmann actually was kidnapped from Argentina. So this thing is highly personal. And the question you're raising is highly personal. I had the honor and role in writing the IDF's Israeli Defense Ethics Code. And I want to begin with good. I want to begin with addressing the question you raised, Michael. How does a soldier know? And first, every soldier in the military, in the Israeli military, carries the ethics code with him. And the ethics code gives some guidance, initial guidance, of what is wrong in doing in those situations. There is a section, and he has to know three things to start with. First, force he has to use only for the purposes of the mission. So if he breaks into a home, and there is a terrorist in the home, and for that sake you have to break the door, or you might have to break a wall, that doesn't mean that you can break the TV or furniture. That's vandalism. That's acting like thugs, not like soldiers. So first thing he knows and is being taught and trained is force is used only for the purposes of the mission. The second thing that he is taught, very important, is that his force ought to be targeted solely to those who pose a threat, not to non-combatants, not to prisoners of war. And when he gets an order to target such people, he ought to refuse it, and he has enough, he or she, have enough experience and understanding what does it mean to target non-combatant. Third thing, which in today's battlefield becomes more and more important, is that he's taught that in cases in which unintended harm is expected, where the target is military, but you're going to have collateral harm to non-combatants, to civilians, he has to do as much as he can to minimize that harm, as much as he can. Now these three, I'm just saying it with brevity as I can, these three things initially have to guide a soldier in his actions. And this is not only aimed at officers or commanders. Actually, this is being taught and read and repeated. And not only that, and internalized through training by every soldier of the military. So you have an initial orientation, an initial understanding of the distinction between a patriotic act of courage and war and a war crime. Now, without that preparation, without that education that you described so powerfully, you cannot then put the burden on the soldier to make the distinction. But as he or she get that education, then they have the tools that obligate them to use their judgment, to realize when a command is blatantly illegal or immoral. I want to say another thing, I want to add another thing, and that relates to an aspect in the initial remarks you made, Michael. I think what's expected of soldiers in the military is rather broad and surprisingly independent. Because the argument, I'm just following orders, have two very different meanings. One is, I have an excuse, I was under duress, I was commanded, I didn't know the whole picture, I was afraid of my commander, there was social pressure, etc., etc. That's one way, so it's a form of an excuse. The other is actually far deeper, which is not an excuse, it's justification, which is following order, that's the ultimate value here, the way Eichmann described it. And we try to educate our soldiers to say this is not only a wrong, very bad, unaccepted excuse, it's also even worse form of justification. Because discipline has to serve a goal. It shouldn't be fetishized as such. Which means that when a soldier encounters something, it's not enough that he said, I'm not going to follow it. He has to actually warn his superior that there might be a problem here. That maybe actually that person who looks like a combatant is a civilian, etc., etc. So there is an expectation of ongoing independent judgment in action that pertains to all these set of activities.
In fact, we call that now mission command, which is this notion that if a subordinate sees something that perhaps doesn't seem to align with what kind of order he or she was just given, it is expected that you go back and ask the question and get some clarification or share what you're observing on the ground, because perhaps things have changed in your view may be more in line with what exactly is happening, what ought to happen going forward. So there's an expectation that there's either questions of clarification or just saying, this is not what I'm seeing on the ground, and to have independent judgment, and that's expected.
So I'd like to press you on the notion of in the heat of battle. I don't know how many of you have watched this remarkable series, documentary on the Vietnam War, which I strongly urge you to watch. It is quite extraordinary. They have an extended section on the My Lai massacre, and they show what I don't think many Americans know, that massacre was stopped by a helicopter pilot who simply landed his helicopter between the American soldiers and the Vietnamese villagers, the civilians. He landed his helicopter and stopped the killing. But what about the soldiers under command who were ordered to shoot in circumstances where they had often encountered enemy fire from villages just like this one? It's not easy to know what to do. And there were a range of reactions in the field. There were soldiers who fired and killed. There were soldiers who fired in the air because they didn't want to participate in this massacre. There was one soldier who shot himself in the foot to take himself out of this awful moment. What do we expect of 19-year-olds in a situation like that?
I mean, 19-year-olds, first of all, they're given a lot of power, which is the power to kill. And this idea that they're merely kids, these young kids, they're given power that nobody gets in a law-abiding community. And power means also responsibility. They're given a power that nobody has. So the idea is to say, well, these are just merely kids shooting at people, is in some ways a misdescription and infantilizing them as a group of people, young men or women, who have the power to kill. Now, with the power to kill comes immense responsibility. By the way, I just want to say one other responsibility they have. And I'm talking as well from my own experience in the heat of battle. They have a responsibility to perform the mission. By the way, it's a very complicated thing. And you want to teach them to act against their initial instincts, which is to avoid contact, to hide, to follow their survival instinct, which is very understandable. So there is a lot going on in preparing them to that moment. And there was an Israeli case where a soldier was ordered by his commander to shoot a rubber bullet. It wasn't a lethal shooting, but still a rubber bullet towards a handcuffed prisoner of war. And when he was court-martialed, and he said, "I followed order." And the court said, "No, you're going to be sent to prison because any reasonable soldier has to understand that a handcuffed prisoner of war doesn't pose any danger." So we have to remember that when you grant the people such power, you have to expect of them this sort of responsibility. I must say, from the whole spectrum of responses that you're describing in the incidents in Vietnam, I wish there was a soldier that would say enough, who he would have put himself between his comrades and the Vietnamese the way the pilot did. So yes, I mean, this is an expectation that comes with the immense power that soldiers have.
I might also just, as you talk about the preparation, it is so important that as units train and prepare, that it's done with the values of dignity and respect for human life, for one another. We have a very diverse Army. We have a diverse Corps of Cadets at West Point. And to learn and train and you have to live with people from all walks of life, it gives you that sense of empathy and develops, I think, that the importance of dignity and respect, which is such a bedrock when you're faced with such complex and challenging situations. There's a phrase when I was the department head of the Department of Social Sciences, we had a motto, Humani Nihil Alienum, which was written by a playwright during Roman times, happened to be a slave at one point. I think Maya Angelou talks about it. The first part of the phrase is, "I am human." And then the second part is, "Nothing of the human condition is alien to me." Meaning, when you do see an atrocity, to realize a human did it, and you can never say, I can never do that, because a human did it. And that's really the first step in identifying one's own vulnerability, which is very, very important, as well as empathy. But if you can identify those vulnerabilities, it's so important because then you can start taking steps to mitigate those vulnerabilities. And so when we think at West Point, it's not just the individual responsibility that you have in terms of acting in accordance with those kinds of values, but it is knowing how to lead and create a command climate that has those values so that the soldiers who are under you understand the expectations, because should you be the one to give an order that is illegal or immoral, that's going to have a profound impact on those that you just described who are being asked to carry it out. So it is important at West Point not just to inculcate those habits of mind and judgment and character, but to know that those cadets will soon be leading others, and they need to provide a kind of command climate that's going to be healthy and represent dignity and respect, as well as knowing that you got to accomplish the mission.
I want to just say one thing, thinking about this case that you're raising. I think we've all the expectation of soldiers not to follow such orders and to disobey them, and not only that, being punished for following them. A system or an army or a military has to do its own soul searching. How do soldiers get to such a point and do what they do? There must have been something in the general environment, in what they saw before, in the behavior of their commanders, in the demoralization that they went through, what I would call shrinking their moral horizons to maybe one principle, which is comradeship. They're going to defend one another, but the rest, the hell with it. The kind of cynicism and despair that is atmospheric. And it's atmospheric and could happen to very decent armies. So any decent army, any decent society, besides saying to those soldiers, look, when you get such an order, you have to refuse. We're not going to accept this either as an excuse or a justification. A system has to do serious soul searching. How does that thing happen? And one thing that I think you mentioned, which is very important, soldiers are looking very carefully at their commanders, their immediate commanders, and they read them the way adolescent kids read their parents, right? They know exactly when they lie, right? They are almost, how would I say, they're phony detectors, right? They detect very well what you mean seriously and not, and when do you wink, and what corners you cut. And they're mimetic creatures. And they follow examples. I think moral education is about that, right? And the worst thing for soldiers is when they encounter a gap between what they were told in principle and what they see in action by their immediate supporters. And then they somehow internalize the fact that really this is not serious. This is all a game. So we should think educationally and humanly. I think this is not only about battlefield, it's everywhere. It's police conduct, it's other things. What is this sort of educational gaps or flaws that create such an action?
So that raises the question of how one enforces that accountability of hierarchy. In World War II in the Philippines, a Japanese General Yamashita, was held responsible for crimes committed by Japanese soldiers in areas where command control had failed. But this was called commander liability. And I I think the case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I believe they upheld the conviction with some remarkable dissents. But the question is, how many, at what level of command do we place responsibility for incidents like My Lai, which are not just the work of the captain in the field? How do we create a sense of responsibility up the hierarchy? And clearly, what we did with General Yamashita is not the right way. There has to be a better way of establishing the liability of commanders up the chain.
So there are, I think, two issues here. Many times when mid-level commanders issue such commands, it's within what they call the spirit of the high command. I mean, usually higher officers are sophisticated enough not to actually exactly say that, but to give a sense that that's actually what's expected. I mean, there was an Israeli case of a colonel who was demoted and put in prison for certain actions, and it was clear in this atmosphere that what the high command, higher officers on the chain gave a sense that that's actually what's expected without them saying it. And clearly they will have to be responsible not only for what they said, but for their omissions, or what I would say for their winking, or for their smile, or for their body language, or for things that they say, quickly just to say. And by the way, one thing again is soldiers and low-level officers have an uncanny feel for that. So I think this thing has to be thoroughly investigated and see, was there an atmosphere, was there an indirect mode of letting to understand that this is something expected, though not ordered. Very important. The second thing I think, and that happens in many armies, is that such accidents of brutality, though here and there they get to court, many times they're covered. And, I don't know exactly, I followed carefully the Vietnam series you're watching, and I actually back home in Israel, I said to a few generals, all the army should watch this series. And I recalled how accidentally it was that this was discovered altogether. All right. And you ask yourself, did that happen many times that we don't know? Did it happen a few other times where those soldiers actually saw it being covered? So the second thing I would say is to what degree the Supreme Command was engaged in covering, marginalizing cases like that when they came up. Now it's very difficult. And there is a lot of room for moral self-deception in these cases. So my own judgment will be command liability per se, in a formal sense, is an empty category. It's an unfair category for the top echelon. But you don't have to search for the order given. There are many other things that can be looked at. Cover-ups, giving a sense that that's expected, personal behavior. By the way, many times those officers behave to their own soldiers this way. Brutality doesn't stop with the enemy, right? It usually cuts across to your troops. So that's where I would look into morally, legally, in such a case of command liability.
But I would just reinforce, I think you do have to see, in one sense where orders are coming from. But then what should a commander, or did the commander know, if not giving the orders, of what was going on, and perhaps should the commander have known, is something that would need to be asked. And certainly I agree, it's what we call command climate, it's how you live your life in front and not in front. It's a 24-hour, 7 days a week, the way you live your life. And as you say, soldiers are watching. And it should be very clear what the expectations are, in that should there be any, and obviously atrocities is the extreme, but how even missteps are approached is very important as well. And when bad news is happening, how do you respond to bad news? Because if you respond to bad news, whether it's a little bit, especially if it's a little bit, no one's going to bring bad news to you, and then it's going to be hard to even address minor infractions, let alone big challenges. So, yeah, I think it's an important question that there's no one final answer, but there needs to be, I think, context understood, investigations done, and judgments made appropriately.
Okay, before inviting you to ask questions or make arguments, I want to raise one further tough question. Moshe said that in cases where the enemy is firing from civilian cover, or where the military target is adjacent to residential areas, soldiers are obligated to do everything they can to minimize damage to the civilians, to minimize the collateral damage, everything they can consistent with carrying out the mission. Now, everything they can is a phrase that conceals what we're actually asking of soldiers in many of these cases, and that is, we're asking them to take risks for themselves in order to minimize the risks that they will impose on the civilian population, which is an enemy civilian population, and one that is being perhaps used by the enemy. So we have a moment in the Afghan war when General McChrystal issued a series of orders which were designed to minimize civilian casualties. And they definitely involved soldiers accepting risks. And the New York Times did a series of interviews with American soldiers on the ground, ordinary soldiers, who complained about this. McChrystal's orders would make war too dangerous for them, even if it made war less dangerous to civilians. So here is another question. Are soldiers obligated to accept orders which put their lives at risk for the sake of civilian lives? And what level of risk is acceptable? Now, the answer can't be 14. It is a very, I have talked to junior officers from Afghanistan and from the IDF who describe this as the hardest decision they have to make. So what can we say about that kind of decision?
It is interesting because, I won't speak to that specific, but if you think about the different levels of understanding what's happening strategically, so strategically, in order to secure national interests, because we're sent in areas not just for the heck of it, we're sent to secure national interests, etc. If there's obviously atrocities going on, we're addressing that, or human disasters going on. And sometimes at the low level, you don't understand that strategic perspective. And so, for example, when you're involved in counterinsurgencies and you're trying to make connections with the local people and to better understand what's happening and to do force protection for the locals and so forth, sometimes it requires not coming up to, and I worked with human terrain teams in Iraq, and it's interesting because if you have a weapon on you, you might not think you're threatening, but when you walk up to a civilian, whether you realize it or not, you can come across in a threatening way. And so sometimes it's important to assume some risk, and it's in terms of managing the mission and accomplishing the mission, and sometimes it's not readily apparent in a tactical environment in terms of the strategic gain that we're trying to achieve. Having said that, that's not a specific answer to your question, because I don't think there can be a specific answer to your question. And between the most important thing among soldiers and leaders and so forth is trust. And so you're trusting, in that case, that the command that you're given is for maybe at the strategic level, but is for mission accomplishment and ensuring that we're mitigating risks towards civilians, non-combatants, which is extremely important. And it's not always evident at the lowest level why this is happening. And that's where there could be some clarification, right? So if there's a platoon leader who feels that his or her platoon leader is assuming too much risk, you can ask the question going forward to the company commander, battalion commander. But at the end of the day, that's where there are, as you mentioned in the beginning, discipline is best served. So not a specific answer to your question.
So that's a really difficult question, but it's a difficult question within a larger difficult condition in which soldiers are nowadays. Young soldiers, let's say if I compare my generation of soldiering and my children's generation in Israel, they're thrust into a battle in which the sort of moral burden on them is much more than other soldiers ever experienced. When Israel fought at 73 in the Sinai Desert or Golan Heights, two armies were clashing with one another, and usually the moral questions of soldiers will be treatment of POW, looting, but not more than that. There were two distinct armies clashing with one another in an open field. Because the enemy intentionally locates itself within civilian population, not distinguish his own combatants from his civilian environment, that puts immense burden on every soldier, level of sergeants and lieutenants and even regular soldiers, to make moral choices. They have to see, is that person on the roof, is he a scout? Is he a frightened civilian? Does he have a pipe in his hand? Does he have a rifle in his hand? And now these are, which means that the level of preparation to such questions will be far greater. And if you don't prepare them for this, you betray them as human beings. Needless to say, betray them as soldiers. So this is, we have to realize that your question, which is very difficult, is just another item within a larger rethinking of moral education of soldiers within a new environment of battlefield. So I'll give you an example. I was talking to cadets Israeli cadets, and one cadet said, in some ways, what you described, said, all these rules, I have to perform a mission, And his commander said, very powerfully, he said, if someone shoots at you from a crowd, and rather than aiming with a sniper, you use the tank. In the military, you can say words you cannot say in civilized society, but let's say you botched the whole thing, right? You killed civilians in ways that you didn't exercise your responsibility to minimize harm to people who were just there. Now, so there is a larger question here, which, by the way, means vis-a-vis discipline, that you want to encourage independent thinking, because the nature of those decisions that we're going to have to face are very different from the battles 20 years ago, 30 years ago that you fought. And this is an unavoidable thing, because you want to send them to war in ways that are going to win the war, but in ways that are going to come home and be able to look themselves in the mirror and say, we're human beings. So there is, I'm not trying to avoid the answer, just trying to locate it in a larger setup of a new problem. Now, as far as risk, you expect what I would call calculated risks. You don't expect them to commit suicide or to put immense risk on the soldiers in order to minimize harm for civilians, but they're calculated risks. And by the way, soldiers know what is calculated risk, officers know. And another thing is, if those values are internalized, mistakes will be made. All those principles are not there to substitute for judgment, but to guide judgment. And you say, okay, you can ask yourself, can I do this? I mean, because if you assume no risk, you rather, just throw a nuclear bomb on the other side. You're not going to risk any of your soldiers. The idea of no risk leads to horrible things, I think, from the perspective of, so we take no risks, we basically come into an area, we just cover it with artillery. So there is an expectation, and I would say the following, it's like with interrogators. If you tell interrogators, you can extract the information in any means you want, they're going to torture they're going to torture the interrogee, and there's always a connection. This is something I always saw between incompetence and brutality. We have to remember that as well. There is a connection between incompetence and brutality. Competent, good units can operate in complex environment by assuming calculated risks. Assuming calculated risks. And this is something that it's not knowing what, it's knowing how, it's practiced, it's shown, it's talked about, but there is an assumption of assuming calculated risk. I want to say another thing just by concluding my remarks on that. One thing just to know soldiers. Soldiers are not going to follow a commander that keeps on risking them in vain. Whatever he thinks or she thinks that they're being followed. If, for example, soldiers think that their commander doesn't know how to navigate, they're going to navigate themselves, right? So part of the authority to command has to do with respect for you as a professional commander, as someone who knows the work, right? We have seen places in which, soldiers between themselves understand this is an unworthy person that we're going to put our fate in their hands, and they're not going to follow commands. They're going to find a way to do what they understand. So you have to build the sense of trust and professionalism value in order to expect soldiers to assume risks as soldiers.
In fact, I had the opportunity to meet up with soldiers who were in the northern part of Iraq, but at the time I had an opportunity to meet, they were called Sons of Iraq. So this was the fighters who mostly came from Anbar province, but who were fighting the U.S. during the early part of the Iraq War, and then there was the reconciliation that occurred. And the fighters then became partners, and they became Sons of Iraq, and they would wear PT physical training, like just a reflective belt. That was a uniform. And I remember turning towards one of the soldiers after we had a chance to meet a few of the sons of Iraq, and I turned to him and said, "So what do you think?" And he said, "Well, we were fighting them not too long ago, but this is much better." But there was a trust that this change of thinking and change of fighting was helping the mission, and there was trust that this was a good move forward. And yes, there was some risk, obviously, if you're looking at people who were fighting you not too long ago, but that this is now going to be a more productive, constructive way forward. And so it was interesting just to get his take on what he saw, especially going from one to the other extreme, from fighting versus now partnering with these other folks out there.
The documentary on Vietnam has some quite wonderful accounts of the relationship between junior officers and men in the field, which illustrate all of the things that we've been talking about here. I think it's time for questions. I don't know if somebody has a microphone. I don't know how this is supposed to be organized. Should I recognize? Yeah.
We don't have a Q&A mic, so you just have to talk loudly.
Okay, so let's start here.
Thank you so much for that very enlightening presentation.
You have to talk louder. First, I have to hear it.
It seems to me that a distinction has to be made between these moral and ethical issues under fire as opposed to those orders that are given prior to an emergency situation. For instance, 12 years ago in Israel, soldiers were given the orders to destroy 21 communities. Soldiers went into communities to obliterate them. I was there in one of them, and I witnessed the tanks coming in and so on. There were soldiers who refused to participate in that, and they were given the option to, I understand, you probably know more about this, Mr. Halbertal, they were given the option to tell the commanding officers that they would not participate in it. So how do we deal with such a situation?
So the question has to do with commandments given before, not in the heat of battle, but commandments given at the strategic level, and an incident that I don't know about from the early history, I think.
No, I know what she means. Yeah. It's the unilateral evacuation from Gaza, right?
Correct.
I was worried at the beginning when I said, when did Israeli soldiers get an order to destroy?
2005.
Yeah, but I was thinking that this is a completely illegal order. But you mean something else, I guess. You mean the order to evacuate settlements in Gaza Strip. Okay. So just to set the record in a proper
Right,
way.
and unfortunately, other settlements in Judea and Samaria that were also ordered to be destroyed.
Right.
And that's soldiers being given orders that are really
Okay.
not military orders. But
Okay.
These were not enemy villages.
No, they were not. They were not, and they were not. I want to say one thing about this question. This is really pertains to a larger issue of Israeli politics and life. And since we tend, I just want to say one thing about loyalty of soldiers. Israel is a very politically divided community, right? This is not news. But we are a democracy. And some soldiers, by the way, fight in wars that they think actually are not particularly proper and just. Not in the way the army conducts a war, right? I fought in a war that I thought was wrong. not the behavior of the military. I mean, the 82 war was the Israeli version of Vietnam. Not as bad, but close to as stupid. Now other soldiers might think that serving in the territory is the wrong thing because Israel has to give back the territories. Then other soldiers might think that evacuating settlements is the wrong order. But what you expect of soldiers, and this is very important if you want a unified military force, is that you expect of soldiers to say, though I politically disagree with that, I'm going to fight because I expect of the other soldier to make the same judgment, and we have what we call the privilege of a democratic society. I'm going to do that in the civilian ground. And at the moment, the democratically elected government decides on a military operation, whether you like it or not, as long as the military itself behaves in a proper way of conduct, it's not up to the soldiers. It will be terrible for Israel if the army will be divided politically. I mean, this war I fight, this war I don't fight, this war is decided by Rabin, so this is okay, this war is decided by Sharon, I don't like it, or vice versa. So I just want to say one thing. The evacuation of Gaza wasn't an illegal order. Might be politically wrong, might be politically stupid, might be other thing. It's not of the sort of orders that war atrocities talked about. Now we come to a different question, which is very important to Israel as a society. How you maintain a unity of fighting forces within a deeply divided political community. And you have to remember, the Israeli army is a civilian army. It's not a professional army. It brings people from all spectrum of political life, from the left to the center to the right, etc. You have kibbutznikim of the left, you have settlers, and they have to fight together. And the last thing you want, the military, is to engage in political judgment of which unit fights which war and when. That will be the end of the precious thing called Israel. And I must say, you might be very upset by the decision of this unilateral evacuation. This wasn't a blatantly illegal order. Now the army, by the way, sometimes might say, I don't want soldiers to clash with their deeply held beliefs, and I would not ask them to do it. But that's what's called command discretion, and it shouldn't be too promiscuously used, because there's no end to it. But I talk too much.
Yes.
My question is just if you have a, by the way, thank you very much for your course you made a connection between brutality and incompetence. But sometimes I imagine that's the opposite of what is the case. You might have a unit where someone is very brutal and very competent, and people in the unit may respect that person and may be taught to, or maybe inclined to follow that brutality because of that. And is there anything that can be done about that?
The question was, Moshe had said that incompetence produces brutality. Sometimes. And here we were invited to imagine a situation in which a brutal commander is highly competent, which makes the brutality worse because more effective.
So the question is, I'm not sure what anything to do.
Anything you can do about that in training?
Right.
Yeah, well, I think it's what we've been talking about in terms of the preparation, that brutality goes goes against the professional ethic in terms of what you're trying to achieve. It has not only deleterious effects on the population, but also on your own people, who you're asking to carry that out. So there's a lot that can be done, and I would hate to think that soldiers would value, you can be highly competent, but for the wrong purpose, and that no longer allows you to be called competent, I think, in that regard. So yes, there's a lot that can be done about that.
Yeah, it's, you are describing poisonous charisma, right? We know that. And that usually has to be detected very early by the superiors of that particular commander. It will be very hard for soldiers to resist that sort of poisonous charisma. And it has infectious, very bad effect on the troops. And that whoever has that type of charisma, right, harms the souls of these soldiers as people and betrays them as human beings. And by the way, many times harms the operation itself with all of the success that he might have. But yes, this is a challenge, and if there are such officers, they have to be recognized and moved.
Yes.
I have a question for the general. I want to posit a situation where I am a soldier in a unit, and I am told by my commanding officer to do something that I find is morally reprehensible. I don't do it. The unit survives, everybody comes back. What happens to me as a practical matter? What really happens?
Well, I think it all depends on the situation and what you would not.
The question is, if a soldier refuses a command, just doesn't do it, what happens to him in practice, not in theory, but in practice, what happens?
So it depends. So it depends on what the soldier refused to do, in the context in which he or she refused to do it, what kind of impact it had on the fellow soldiers and on the mission. Clearly, if it's of the magnitude that we've been discussing in terms of being something immoral or unethical, then that will be something that would be investigated, etc. If it's something that the soldier just refused to do, then there's, on the Uniform Code of Military Justice, there are actions to be taken, both administrative and criminal, depending on, again, how bad it was. There's all kinds of Inspector General kinds of investigate. I mean, so there's a number of things can be looked into.
Am I going to get an opportunity to say I didn't do it because it was a morally improper?
Oh, sure. If there'd be an investigation, and that would all be, you would be interviewed. Again, not knowing what it was, at some level there would be an investigating officer at some level, and everybody would be interviewed, to include the soldier, and then there would be a recommendation going forward in terms of what should or should not happen.
Yes.
Yeah, in that situation, don't you feel there was, generally speaking, a bias against the individual soldier who, I mean, how many cases, is there a preponderance of cases where the individual soldier is told, you know what, you did a good thing, not, going against your conscience, not going against your conscience? I wonder about that.
In practice, the question is, how many soldiers actually get away with or are honored for honorable disobedience?
So, again, it depends. And I don't have statistics, or I haven't seen enough cases, if you would. We have a very, I think, very competent staff judge advocate, where soldiers are allowed to be heard, allowed to bring grievances. We have they can go to their Congress members. There's congressional inquiries that are done. There's, again, Inspector General kinds of avenues, etc., where a full airing can be done in different venues. So I think I would, I'll just share with you, I think for the most part, you have a very fair understanding of what's happened, and sometimes it takes different levels of investigation to air everything out. But again, it's hard to speak without a specific case, but there are many different avenues soldiers can take if there's any grievances in any way, and different venues for that to be heard.
I want to say in that respect, we have cases in which soldiers were tried and punished for it's not about conscience, it's about actually doing something that was blatantly illegal, which they should have understand. And they were punished and they were imprisoned for that.
And what if it was just against their conscience,
No, against,
but not illegal?
that's a different,
How would that be handled?
it's only handled, I mean, it's, unless they are systemically against any use of violence, etc., in their life. They're not going to shoot someone who's threatening them in the street, etc., etc. They will have an exemption, but they cannot use their conscience selectively. And if they use, they're going to find themselves in jail.
Yes.
At the beginning, one of the things, I think you listed 3 items that a soldier has to live by. One was you can only use force in furtherance of the mission. So from a practical standpoint, what you're really asking this 19-year-old kid to do is not only make a moral judgment one way or the other, but wait a minute, I got to stop and figure out whether that 19-year-old kid really understands what that mission is. I think that's a huge disconnect.
Well, so let's take, usually we talk about scenarios, right? That's the best, right? And he enters a house and he says, this house is needed for having a control of the area, visual control of the area. And he realized that while he was there, he destroyed everything in the house. Nothing was left intact, all the furniture, everything, etc. And he's asked to serve in a roadblock. And the goal of the roadblock is to avoid the movement of weapons or terrorists in the world. And he's actually using it in order to, in order to let civilians dry, just wait, or for them to give him money so they can pass through the roadblock. These are cases. I mean, these are clear cases. Now there are cases in which there will be different judgments. That's fine, but there are clear cases in which force is used, nothing to do with the mission. By the way,
I'm not talking about the extreme case.
That's what we are talking about, the extreme case.
I'm talking about a situation, for example, if you want to talk situation, where the mission is, we're going to capture this town. You see that house over there? That house over there is part of your mission. And he gets in there and he finds that there's nothing but civilians in there, and he opens fire. Now, is he guilty?
At the civilians? We see civilians
He
and
doesn't
open.
know that they're civilians.
No.
He goes in there and there are nothing but civilians in there.
After he shot and he realized that he shot civilians.
He followed the mission.
No, we want to get a description because God is here in the details. Right? You mean he entered the house and saw civilians and shot at them? Because there weren't soldiers there to shoot at? That was massacre.
No. He entered the house as part of the mission to secure that house.
Right, that's
Okay,
fine.
And as part of the securing of that house,
He fired.
he went in and he started to shoot.
Look, again, I mean, sometimes, and it happens in wars, sometimes civilians will be killed by mistake, right? That's what I think you're describing. He would enter a house and, there will be fire from the house, so he would think that there is a good reason that there is a threat in the house, and he would shot, and civilians will be killed. He's not going to be blamed, right? He's not.
I guess my concern is that we're asking a 19-year-old kid to make a moral judgment, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And not only that, but do it in the light of, quote, the mission, which this 19-year-old kid was not trained, excuse me, at West Point. He might have graduated from high school. We don't know. But he is supposed to understand the mission and then instantly take that mission, understanding, and apply that morally to what he finds. And that's an untenable position for a 19-year-old.
You know, I think in the clear, I understand the question, but I think in clear cases it is an expected thing, right? You say, you know, soldiers are trained, understand, you give him weapon, the power to use, and there will be cases in which, you know, there are cases in which you're not expecting him to make those judgments, but there will be what you call the extreme cases in which you say that was wrong and what you did was wrong, and you had to know it. Because, you know, breaking the furniture there wasn't part of the mission, or shooting etc. You know, so we are. I think when a discussion through the conversation, I think we can clarify what is it expected.
I think at the tactical level, the soldier is generally going to understand the mission. It's not that. It's probably not that complicated. There are too many hands. Yes.
Yeah.
So that's going to be an example when the division is what it was. Since of course, what was to be right, it was completed with the academy division.
Sure. I mean, wow, this is a tough set of questions. Well, the Azalia case was a case in which a soldier shot at a terrorist that was already disabled. His argument was that he wasn't aware of it, that he thought that he still poses a threat. And but when you see the film and when you see what happened there, his argument wasn't that accepted. I mean, but we have to get into the details of the case, right? You can, I would say the following: if anybody in the court or in the military thought that what he did was because he had a real doubt that there was a threat, nobody would try him.
Okay. In the back, let's take someone in the
May I
back.
follow up on that question? So, I understand your position on that case. My concern is that I believe it's true that the majority of Israelis have served, and they've carried the card you talked about, and they've had this education of scenarios, and yet I believe at least half of the Israeli population, when they were polled, not in the heat of battle, but in the cool of their living rooms, said that they agree with the soldier because maybe it's a matter of unit cohesion, of us versus them, of existential threat. So my question is, how then, in a situation like that, do you actually practically morally educate? That goes to the U.S. forces too. How do you prepare people? Is it possible, as has been suggested by some, that an 18 or 19-year-old being given immense power suggests that there may be immense abuse, maybe they're too young, or maybe the way we're educating isn't the best?
So let's take the case of the polls in the American society about my life, right? How many of the Americans thought that it was proper to try that officer? If I recall, there was quite a majority against putting him on trial, right? So let's leave Israel for a second, right? You know, population thinks we have to protect our soldiers, and you know, whatever they do wrong, it's ours. And you don't poll, and you don't make your decisions following popular polls. You have professional, serious principles of conduct, right? You know, as I said, I was stunned, by the way, by the amount of Americans thought that he shouldn't be tried. And the politicians wanting to cater to public opinion at the end actually he didn't serve 1 day in prison, if I recall. Now, you cannot base, you have to, this is a difficult work. This is a difficult work, you're right. You have to sometimes isolate the fighting forces from the anger, sometimes legitimate anger that is out there in the street. Because they're gonna, if they follow that anger and their own anger, they're gonna do things that you don't dream of how horrible they are. So right, it's a challenge.
The question is, you called it moral education. The question is, how do you do it so that they do the right thing?
It's called moral education.
I mean, there is education, there is training, there is the principles, the framework of law of armed conflict that we've been discussing, I think, in different ways in terms of making sure that it's military necessity that is guiding this, that the objective is a military target or the military objective, that there's understanding combatants versus non-combatants, and that there's proportionality that is taken into effect. And it is difficult. It's the reason why we have, this is the other side of why we have disciplined forces, because officers are making, based on, again, achieving national gains and national interests, are making strategy that then is translated to missions, which is understood at different levels. And it's important that everyone understands what the mission is, what you're trying to achieve. It's not just blind, as I think you were getting to, perhaps, or blind obedience. It's understanding what are we trying to achieve as a platoon, as a squad, at the very small unit tactic, and then what are the rules of engagement, which I think is part of the discussion here.
I just want to add to the difficulty you raised. Another difficulty, if you want to add to difficulties, that the other side is massacring civilians, right? They're not playing by these rules. Now, I just want to say one thing. If you're going to begin to look like the other side, you lost the war.
We have
Right?
to, we have
Because
to be true.
you broke the backbone of the legitimacy of whom you are and for what you're fighting. And by the way, this is very difficult. But as difficult it is, it's very important.
You want to say?
That's-
I think I have my own response to that last point. You want, in cases like My Lai or the case in Israel, you want professional judgment, but you have to hope for political leaders who will support the professional judgments. And we didn't have that at the time of My Lai, and Israel doesn't have it today. Yes, here.
I know it's something you have to leave, right? You need to be so I'm going to say we have time for 2 more questions. Sorry, yes.
Yes.
Gentlemen,
All right.
my question has to do with basic training. I know that the officers at West Point get this extensive training, and you spoke of that. But what is given to these 17, 18, 19-year-olds who may not have even finished high school in their basic training? How much time is actually spent training them and talking to them, going over all of these issues?
Yeah, the basic training of ordinary soldiers, not officers to be at West Point, but the basic training of ordinary soldiers, how much time is given to ethical questions?
So there's, just to be clear, there's basic training, then there's what's, I think, phenomenal in the military organization is that you have different levels of training as you go. So it's not just one time and off you go, but there's training that occurs at the basic level, there's training that continues, ongoing training when you're in your small unit, and the non-commissioned officers, which is really the backbone of the Army, they also go through education and training. So at all different levels, it doesn't just stop once you arrive at your unit, but it continues, and it's incumbent upon the officers and non-commissioned officers of that unit to ensure that the soldiers are receiving that as well, and that is part and parcel of the training that they have. So it's ongoing.
The officer mentioned that sometimes there's a breakdown in the command structure in the Army when there's a war.
but almost invariably and disproportionately, it's the junior officers, the fighting soldiers, suffer the brunt of the court-martials. And it's not going to stop.
Yeah, so I don't recall talking about a breakdown, but that's why it's important that at all levels, it's not just the top level, but at all levels, that there is this intense education and training. And I had talked about mission command, that there is a permission given, implicit and explicit, that if you don't understand either what the command, the mission is, or the command that you're given, or if you are given a command and you're looking at your area of operations and see something different, it is expected that you go back and either ask for clarification or share that there needs to be a shift in the mission because of what you're seeing on the ground.
Okay, last question, the lady in the back.
Oh, thank you. I'm just curious about something. All of this education, sorry, do my Broadway voice, all of this education and training comes to the surface in a scenario that I may have 2 seconds, 1 second to react. Someone's pointing a gun at me or coming at me with a knife. I decide to take action and I shoot. How do you measure the level of fear that I may have, my partner may have? How does it factor into my commanding officer's judgment of my decision, as well as a court of law and a court of public opinion?
Yes, this is someone coming at you, at me with a knife.
Yes.
Is not a non-combatant.
You just kill him.
Thank you very much.